In this lesson, part 3 of Unit 5, we're going to examine the basic rules of probability. These are the same rules that apply when you roll dice in Monopoly. If you wanted to calculate the probability of the dice landing on 8 or 11 or 12, or the rules of probability that determine that every time you toss a coin, you have a 50% probability of it landing on tails. Those same rules of probability can be applied to genetics. And you should realize that anytime you do a Punnett square, you're simply calculating the probability of a particular genotypic outcome based on the genotypes of the parents. It's all about probability. So we're going to look at how to use rules of probability in genetics. Specifically, we're discussing pages 221 to 222 in the Campbell Biology in Focus textbook. Okay, so recently you have mastered dihybrid cross Punnett squares. So let's kick it up a notch. Here is a problem that could be solved with a pentahybrid cross. So look at parent number 1, heterozygous for the first 2 traits, homozygous recessive for the third, heterozygous, crossed with parent number 2, that is heterozygous, homozygous recessive for the second trait, heterozygous, homozygous recessive. So we're looking at 5 different traits. That's a pentahybrid cross. What is the probability that the first offspring produced will have this genotype? Now, the answer turns out to be a 1 out of 64 probability, or you could express it as 16 offspring out of 1,024 offspring would be expected to have this genotype. Now, how do you solve that? Well, you could do a pentahybrid cross, an enormous Punnett square, but just so you know, a pentahybrid cross would be 32 possible eggs down the side and 32 possible sperm across the top. It would be 1,024 boxes to fill in. Nobody would really want to have to do that, and there's got to be a much more efficient way to come up with this answer, and there certainly is, and it's easy to do if you understand the basic rules of probability and how they apply to genetics. That's what we're going to learn today. Now, if you are one of my current AP Biology students here at Union Pines High School, then you either have just recently received a paper copy of a packet that goes along with this lesson, or I will post a PDF file on Google Classroom and you can print that at home. But you definitely want to have the packet available to kind of follow along through the examples that I'm going to discuss. So here is what it looks like. This is the first page of the packet. We're going to discuss statistical rules, also known as rules of probability, and use them to solve some sample problems and then also use them to solve some real genetic problems. The 2 rules that we will learn how to use are called the rule of multiplication and the rule of addition. The rule of multiplication says the probability that 2 independent events will occur simultaneously is the product of their individual probabilities. Now, what that means is if you toss a coin, we all know you have a 50% chance or a 1 out of 2 chance of that coin landing on heads. But let's suppose you and a friend each toss your own separate coins at the same time. The probability that your coin lands on heads and your buddy's coin also lands on heads at the same time is 1 out of 2 multiplied, it's called rule of multiplication, multiplied times 1 out of 2. So the total probability that both coins land on heads at the same time is actually 1 out of 4, because we have to multiply the individual probabilities. The other rule is called rule of addition. The probability of an event that can occur in 2 or more independent ways is the sum of the separate probabilities of those different ways. Now, neither one of these probably makes a whole lot of sense until we look at some practical examples. So let's do that now. Okay, so let's look at an example of how to apply the rule of multiplication. Remember, it says the probability that independent events will occur simultaneously is the product of their individual probabilities. So let's suppose we have 2 pea plants, and they're both heterozygous for flower color, big P, little p. Okay, so here's parent number 1, here's parent number 2. And we want to calculate the probability that the offspring will be homozygous recessive, little p, little p. Now, you could do that with a Punnett square, and you probably could just picture that Punnett square in your head. You don't really have to do a lot of math to figure out that the probability is 1 out of 4. But here's how you calculate that using rule of multiplication. In order to get little p, this parent would have to pass down a little p at the same time that this parent passes down little p. So that is independent events, and they have to occur at the same time. So we got to multiply their probabilities. The probability that this parent will pass down little p is 1 out of 2. And the probability that this parent will pass down little p is 1 out of 2. So if we multiply 1/2 times 1/2, we get an overall probability of 1 out of 4. It's the same probability that your coin and your friend's coin will both land on heads at the same time. 1 out of 4 chance. Now, if that doesn't quite resonate with your brain, here's something we can all relate to, because we've all played Monopoly at some point, or some kind of game that involved rolling dice. And let's say you're playing Monopoly and you really want to land on Boardwalk because that's the last valuable property that you haven't already purchased, and you really want to buy it before your competitors can buy it, and you are 12 spaces away. You really want to roll a 12. How likely are you going to roll a 12 when you have 2 dice? And it's very easy to calculate that. The only way to get a 12 is to roll the dice and come up 6 and 6. That's the only combination that adds up to 12. The probability of getting a 6 on the first die is 1 out of 6, because it's a 6-sided die. The probability of getting a 6 on the second die is also 1 out of 6. We need both of those to happen at the same time on the same roll. So 1/6 multiplied times 1/6 is 1 out of 36 chance. So it's a pretty low probability, and that's why you don't very often land on 12 when you're playing Monopoly. It only happens about 1 time out of every 36 rolls of the dice. Okay, so that's called rule of multiplication. Now, let's go to the second rule, which is called rule of addition. The probability of an event that can occur in 2 or more independent ways is the sum of the separate probabilities of those different ways. So we're going to have to do some adding. Okay, so let's suppose we have our same two pea plant parents, okay, big P little p crossed with a big P little p, but this time we want to know what is the probability that the offspring is also heterozygous, not little p like before, but this time big P little p. Well, if you do a Punnett square, you can very quickly determine that it's 2 out of 4. It's a 1 out of 2 chance or a 2 out of 4 chance, 50% chance. But let's understand why that is using the rule of addition. When these two parents pass down their genes, in order to get an offspring that's big P little p, that can happen two separate ways, right? The first parent could pass down a big P in the egg, and the second parent could pass down a little p in the sperm. That would give us big P little p. But that's not the only way it could happen. It's possible that the first parent could pass down a little p in the egg, and the second parent pass down a big P in the sperm. That would also give us big P little p. So there's two separate scenarios, two separate ways to end up with the same outcome of big P little p. And so if we want to know the total probability of that occurring, we have to calculate the probability that it'll happen this way, with big P in the egg and little p in the sperm, plus, rule of addition, we got to add, plus the probability that it might happen this way, little p in the egg, big P in the sperm. So let's do that, okay? So the first way, big P in the egg, little p in the sperm, the probability would be 1 out of 2 multiplied times 1 out of 2, so that's a 1/4 probability. Now you'll notice I did use rule of multiplication. I know we're talking about rule of addition right now, but in this little step, I do have to multiply 1/2 times 1/2 to get this 1/4. So rule of multiplication still applies, but now we're going to add this probability to this probability over here, because the probability of getting little p in the egg, big P in the sperm, is 1/2 times 1/2, 1/4. But remember, it's called rule of addition. So what do we do with those two individual probabilities? We have to add them together. The total probability that two parents like this would end up with an offspring that is also heterozygous, that's a 1 out of 2 probability. Now again, if you're having trouble figuring out why is that, that's not clicking in my brain, think about dice. Go back to the Monopoly game. We already calculated the probability of rolling a 12, 1 out of 36. What about the probability of rolling an 11? You might think, well, it's the same, isn't it? It'd still be the same as the probability of rolling a 12, but it's not. You have a better chance of rolling an 11, a greater probability of rolling an 11 than you do of rolling a 12. And we're going to find out why that is in just a moment. Now, the thing about rolling an 11 with dice is that there's two ways that can happen. You could land on 6 with the first die and 5 with the second die, that's 11. Or you could land on a 5 with the first die and a 6 with the second die, that's also 11. So we have to calculate, using rule of multiplication, the probability of getting 11 the first way, 1 out of 6 multiplied times 1 out of 6, 1 out of 36. The same as the probability of rolling a 12. But then we have to calculate the probability of landing on 11 the other way. 1 out of 6 times 1 out of 6 is 1 out of 36 chance. So the total probability that when I roll those two dice, I'm going to get 11 is the sum of those two individual probabilities. 1 out of 36 plus 1 out of 36 is, of course, 2 out of 36, which is reduced down to a 1 out of 18 chance. It's exactly twice as likely to happen as rolling a 12. So you're going to get 11 in Monopoly twice as often as you're going to get 12. That's using rule of addition. Okay, so let's look at another problem that will involve both rule of multiplication and rule of addition. This is example number 3. And I don't want to just give you the answer. So what I'd like you to do is to read the problem and then pause the video. Work this out on your paper. See if you can calculate the correct answer on your own, and then you can unpause the video and check your answer. Calculate the chance of rolling a 7 with 2 6-sided Monopoly dice. Go ahead and pause video. Okay, let's see if you did your calculation correctly. So it turns out there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different ways to land on 7. You could get a 6 on the first die and a 1 on the second die. You could get a 5 and a 2, a 4 and a 3, a 3 and a 4, a 2 and a 5, a 1 and a 6. 6 different ways to get a 7. And so we got to calculate the individual probability for each way. That's rule of multiplication. 1 out of 6 times 1 out of 6 is 1 out of 36. But then when we're finished, remember we have to get the sum. We have to add up those individual probabilities. So 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, of course, is 6 out of 36, which reduces down to a 1 out of 6 chance. So you are much, much, much more likely to land on 7 than landing on 12 or 11. There's a reason why it's called Lucky 7 in all games of dice, because it comes up pretty often. About 1 out of every 6 times, you're going to land on 7. That's using rule of multiplication here, but then also rule of addition at the end. Okay, one more little simple example before we dive right into some more complex genetics examples. This one has to do with playing cards, something that I am not very good at. But if you know anything about cards, you know that a standard deck of playing cards has 52 cards. That's not counting the jokers. And let's say somebody shuffles a deck of 52 cards and they deal 4 random cards out of that shuffled deck. And you look at the 4 cards in your hand. You have a 10, maybe it's a 10 of hearts, doesn't matter. Maybe it's a jack of spades, a queen of clubs, and a king of diamonds. The suit doesn't matter, but you have a 10, a jack, a queen, and a king. Those are your 4 cards. Now there's 48 cards remaining in the deck, right? Because 52 cards, you already have 4 of them, so now we know there's 48 cards remaining. And you want to calculate the probability. Maybe you're playing poker. Maybe you're playing a high-stakes poker game, and you sure would like to know what's the probability that my next card, my 5th card, is going to give me a straight, because that's a pretty good hand in poker. And if I think I'm going to get a straight, I might want to bet some serious money. But what is the probability of getting a straight? Now, if you're like me and you don't play a lot of cards, you might be thinking, well, what the heck is a straight? So a straight is 5 consecutive cards, and it doesn't matter what suit they are. So in other words, if I had a 9, that would be 9, 10, jack, queen, king. That would be a straight. And it doesn't matter whether it's a 9 of hearts or a 9 of diamonds. That doesn't matter. Just any 9, 9, 10, jack, queen, king, that's a straight. Or if I got an ace, I could have 10, jack, queen, king, ace. That would also be a straight. That would actually be even better because that's a high straight. So I want to calculate the probability that my very next card will give me a straight. So see if you can figure this one out. This is another good time to pause the video, see what you can work out with your calculation, and then you can turn the video back on to check your answers. Pause the video now. All right, let's see how you did. So there are two ways to get a straight. You can get a 9 or an ace. Out of the 48 cards remaining in the deck, 4 of them are 9s because there's a 9 of hearts, 9 of diamonds, 9 of spades, 9 of clubs. 4 9s out of 48 remaining cards, so that's a probability, 4 out of 48. There's also 4 aces in that deck out of 42 cards. Ace of diamonds, ace of hearts, ace of clubs, ace of spades. So either way, if I get a 9 or an ace, I've got my straight. So the total probability of getting a straight is the sum, rule of addition, the sum of these two probabilities. So that's 8 out of 48, which reduces down to a 1 out of 6 chance. Now this is just a coincidence, but the probability of me getting a straight on my next card is exactly the same as the probability of rolling a 7 with 2 Monopoly dice. Just a coincidence, but kind of interesting. Okay, so now you should feel pretty good at how to use these basic rules of probability. The next step is to use them correctly to solve complex genetics problems. So we'll take a look at that next. Okay, so here is a practice problem. We've got regular garden pea plants like the ones that Mendel used, and here are 3 of the traits that Mendel studied. It says if a plant heterozygous for all 3 traits, so that's big A, big T, big R, little r, if that plant self-fertilizes, pollinates itself, here's what that would look like. Heterozygous for all 3 traits, and now it's going to cross with itself. Okay, we want to know what proportion of the offspring would we expect to be like this: big A, big T, big R, big R. So to figure that out, I've got to figure out, first of all, what is the probability of getting big A, big A? Well, I got a 1 out of 2 chance of getting a big A from this parent, 1 out of 2. And then I've also got a 1 out of 2 chance of getting a big A from this parent. So that's 1/2 times 1/2, 1/4. I can do the same thing for T. 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/4. And I can do the same thing for R. 1/2 times 1/2 is a 4th. Okay? And then rule of multiplication, if I'm going to have one offspring and all 3 of these things are going to happen at the same time in the same offspring, then I've got to multiply those probabilities, rule of multiplication. So multiply your numerator, 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. And then go back and multiply your denominator. 4 times 4 is 16, times 4 is 64. And instead of having to do a tri-hybrid cross, which is like 8 times 8, it's like 64 boxes, I can just calculate the probability without even having to do a Punnett square. Okay, so this is another good time for you to pause the video and see if you can make the other 3 calculations on this problem, and then you can check your work. Go ahead and pause now. Let's see how you did. The probability of getting, with the same 2 parents, getting this offspring, homozygous recessive for all three, again, is 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4, which is a 1 out of 64 chance. So the answer for part A and part B is the same answer. And hopefully you can see why that is. Now, let's see what the probability that these two heterozygous parents would produce a heterozygous offspring, which would look like this. Well, the probability of getting big A little a is 1 out of 2, big T little t 1 out of 2, big R little r 1 out of 2, 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2 is 1 out of 8. That's my answer. And last but not least, the probability of getting homozygous axial, homozygous tall, and heterozygous round is 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/2. So 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. 4 times 4 is 16 times 2 is 32, so that's a 1 out of 32 probability. Now, I've done this for long enough that I know some of you are sitting there thinking, oh, Mr. Cavendish, you're going so fast. How do I know exactly what these little fractions are? I know how to multiply, but how do I know I've got the right fraction? If you're confused as to why this is 1/4 or why this is 1/2, you can always do a Punnett square. Just break it up into little Punnett squares. So if I've got a parent that's big A little a and another parent that's big A little a, I could do that as a Punnett square. Notice I did that right here. And it's going to show me that the probability of the baby having big A is 1 out of 4. The Punnett square shows it's 1 out of 4. So if I couldn't do that in my head, or I couldn't picture that, I couldn't figure out why this fraction is 1 out of 4, maybe it helps to do it as a Punnett square. Okay, let's do the same thing for R. If you're having trouble understanding why this is a 1/2, let's take big R little r and use a Punnett square to cross it with big R little r. Here's my Punnett square. And notice 2 out of 4 offspring are big R little r. And 2 out of 4 is the same thing as 1/2. So hopefully you get to a point pretty soon where you don't actually have to do the Punnett square. You wouldn't really want to have to do 3 separate Punnett squares every single time you solve a problem like this. Hopefully you can either picture the Punnett squares in your head, or you can just get comfortable enough with these probability rules that it just kind of starts to make sense. But when in doubt, I always say, when in doubt, work it out. If you can't figure out the individual probabilities, use a Punnett square. Don't guess. Don't guess. Okay, let's try another one. So here are my two parents. They're both heterozygous for 4 traits this time. We got A, B, C, D, 4 traits. And with these two parents, we want to know what is the probability that they would produce an offspring that is little a, little b, little c, little d, little d. And it's 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4. So it's a big number, 1 out of 256. That's a very, very low probability. Again, if you're puzzled about why these are 1/4, do a Punnett square. Big A little a crossed with big A little a, do the Punnett square, and you'll see 1 out of 4 offspring are going to be little a little a. Okay, 4 times 4 is 16, times 4 is 64, times 4 is 256. Now, pause the video, finish the rest of these calculations, B, C, D, and E, and then check your answer. Did you get them all correct? Now, when you check your answer, if you got the wrong answer for any of these, if you got the wrong answer, look at your individual probabilities and see where you messed up. In other words, if you got something different than 1 out of 28 for this problem, look at your individual probabilities, these little fractions, and see if you messed up and see if you can figure out what you did wrong. Okay, so let's try a couple more. All right, so what is the probability that each of the following pairs of parents will produce the indicated offspring? So in other words, here's two parents. What's the probability that they'll produce this kid? Here's two more parents. What's the probability that they'll make this kid? You do that for each of these four. Pause the video, work them out, check your answers. Okay, let's see how you did. Now this one is kind of interesting because if this parent is big A, the probability that it's going to pass down big A is a probability of 1. That's the same thing as 100% chance. Probability of 1 means it absolutely will happen. A probability of 0 means it absolutely will not happen. So this is a probability of 1 that I'm going to get a big A, and this is a probability of 1 that I'm going to get a little a. So that's 1 times 1 is 1. And you can see that all three of these are going to have a probability of 1, which means this is the kid that will always be produced when these two parents mate. All right, and you can check your answers on the other three. Remember, if you got an incorrect answer, look at your individual probabilities and see what you may have done wrong. And then look here at 3D. This parent has to pass down big A. This parent has to pass down little a. So the probability of heterozygous is 1. Likewise for C, a probability of 1 that I'm going to get a big C, little c. So the only one we really have to calculate is B, heterozygous parent crossed with heterozygous parent. That gives me a 1 out of 2 probability of big B, little b. So 1 times 1/2 times 1, of course, that's 1/2. Okay, and here's the last set of problems. You know what to do. So we've got our two parents up here, and look at their genotypes. So with these two parents in mind, what is the probability that they'll produce this kid, or this kid, or this kid? Okay, so you can see I've done the first one there. So this would be a probability of 1 times 1/2 is 1/2. A probability of 1/2 for big B, little b. Same for big C, little c. And then this is also a half because I'm definitely going to get I'm definitely going to get a little d from this parent, and a half of the time I'm going to get a big D from this parent. So that's 1 times 1/2 gives me a 1/2. These are all 1/2. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. Pause the video, work them out, check your answer. Did you get them right? What about this tricky one right here? Now look, if this parent has big D, little d, and this parent does not have a big D, there's no way an offspring could end up with 2 copies of big D. The only way to get 2 copies of big D is both the dad and the mom have to pass down a big D. We know that cannot happen. The probability that this parent would pass down a big D is 0. So this is a 0 probability. That means there's no way this kid could ever be produced from these two parents. And of course, it doesn't even matter what these other fractions are, because when you multiply anything times 0, the product is, of course, 0. So look at all of your answers. It's important that you understand how to calculate these kinds of probabilities, because you'll definitely do this on the AP exam. You'll do it on our Unit 5 test, which is coming up soon. If you are getting incorrect answers, make sure you figure out what you did wrong on your individual probabilities. And make sure you're always multiplying across. Sometimes people get in a hurry and they'll try to add these fractions at the end, and you get a crazy answer. Make sure you are multiplying. So 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. And then 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. Always multiplying at the end. And that, I believe, is the end of our lesson on probability rules in genetics. Guys, enjoy the rest of your day. See you soon.